If the ground beneath your feet holds more than ancient ruins? What if, buried in the layers of history, Naples guards a secret that defies our understanding of time itself? When archaeologist Clara Venturi uncovers a perfectly preserved chamber deep beneath Naples, she expects ancient artifacts. Instead, she finds the impossible: modern faces staring back from centuries-old mosaics, including her own. As the chamber mysteriously expands and changes daily, Clara races to decipher warnings of an impending disaster hidden in plain sight. What begins as an archaeological curiosity spirals into a terrifying reality. The city doesn't just preserve history, it remembers the future. But the most chilling question remains unanswered. Is Clara meant to prevent the coming catastrophe, or is she unknowingly destined to cause it? The first blow echoed like muffled thunder as the sledgehammer struck ancient stone. Clara Venturi flinched despite her years of experience. Something about this excavation beneath Naples had felt wrong from the start. Dust billowed through shafts of artificial light as the ground beneath the workers' feet shifted, not gradually, but with the abrupt surrender of a seal being broken. "Stop, everyone back!" Professor Marini's voice cracked through the tension, but it was too late. The floor gave way, plunging two workers into darkness. Their screams lasted only seconds before being cut short, not by impact, but by sheer astonishment. Silence engulfed the chamber as the dust began to settle. 20 feet below, where nothing should exist but volcanic rock and debris, stood a perfectly preserved room. The workers were unharmed, standing motionless on an immaculate mosaic floor that glowed under their fallen flashlights. "God in heaven," whispered Marini, his face illuminated by the blue light of his phone. "It's impossible." Clara edged forward, archaeologist instincts overriding caution. The chamber below remained untouched by time. No dust, no deterioration. The preservation defied every natural law of archaeology. Naples had been built and rebuilt, layer upon sedimentary layer, for thousands of years. Nothing remained intact through the volcanic activity, the wars, the reconstructions, yet this space looked as though it had been sealed yesterday. "I'm going down," she announced, securing her harness to a support beam. "Clara, wait for structural assessment," Marini protested, but his eyes never left the spectacle below. She descended slowly, the rope creaking under her weight. The air changed as she dropped, became cooler, drier, inexplicably fresher than the stale underground atmosphere they'd been breathing for weeks. Her boots touched the mosaic floor with a hollow sound that suggested empty space beneath, impossible at this depth. The two workers stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the far wall where flickering flashlight beams revealed what had stopped them cold. "Bring more light," Clara called up, her voice steadier than she felt, "and the documentation equipment." Now, as floodlights were lowered into the chamber, the full horror of the discovery emerged. The mosaic covered not just the floor, but crawled up the walls in vivid, perfectly preserved tesserae. The colors, lapis blue, vermilion, gold, should have degraded over centuries. They hadn't. They remained vibrant, almost luminous. But it was the subject matter that drained the blood from Clara's face. The mosaic depicted people, not ancient Romans or Greeks, not medieval figures. Modern people in contemporary clothes, a woman checking her smartphone, a man in a tailored business suit, a child wearing a t-shirt with a recognizable cartoon character. "This has to be a hoax," whispered one of the workers in Neapolitan dialect, crossing himself. Some contemporary artist playing games. But Clara knew better. The chamber had been sealed beneath layers dated to at least the 17th century. The volcanic ash and sediment above them was undisturbed. No modern artist could have created this and sealed it beneath centuries of geological record. "Document everything," she ordered as more team members descended. "Every square inch. And don't touch anything new." Professor Marini finally joined them, his complexion ashen under the floodlights. "Clara," he said, his voice barely audible, "the central figure." She followed his gaze to the largest figure in the mosaic, positioned directly in the center of the back wall. A woman with dark hair pulled back, wearing a light blue shirt and khaki pants, a small silver pendant visible at her throat. A woman with a small scar at the corner of her right eye, a childhood injury Clara had carried for 30 years. It was her, rendered in perfect detail, down to the mud stain on her left boot from this morning's excavation. "That's not possible," she whispered, stepping closer. The face stared back with an expression Clara couldn't identify. Warning? Resignation? The mosaic. Clara held something in her hands, a small object that looked like... "Professor, you need to see this," called one of the technicians, breaking her trance. He stood at the far end of the chamber where a small alcove had been uncovered. Inside, perfectly preserved, lay a leather-bound journal. Clara approached cautiously, her training battling with primal fear. The technician shone his light on the open pages. The handwriting was neat, precise, and unmistakably hers. But she had never written those words. The date at the top of the page read September 19th, 2025. Today's date. "There's more," the technician said, voice shaking as he stepped back from the alcove. The walls behind the journal were covered with photographs, modern digital photographs printed on paper that should have disintegrated centuries ago. They showed the excavation team. They showed Professor Marini arguing with the university dean last week, a private meeting no one had witnessed. They showed Clara in her apartment last night, reading by the window, and they showed events that hadn't happened yet. "Clear the chamber," Clara ordered, her professional demeanor cracking. "Now!" As the team scrambled toward the ropes, Clara felt drawn to the central mosaic again. Her doppelganger's eyes seemed to follow her, knowing and sad. The object in the mosaic, Clara's hands, was clearer now. A small digital recorder, identical to the one currently tucked in Clara's pocket. With trembling fingers, she withdrew her recorder and pressed play. Her own voice emerged from the speaker, tired and desperate. "If you're hearing this, I'm already part of it. We all are. The city doesn't just appear. It creates itself through us. It's happening again, and I don't know how to stop it." The chamber's lights flickered, plunging everything into momentary darkness. When they stabilized, Clara found herself alone, the rest of the team having evacuated. In the silence, she could swear she heard breathing, not her own, but the slow, patient respiration of something vast and ancient. She raised her eyes to her mosaic counterpart once more. Only now the figure had shifted position slightly. The eyes that had been looking straight ahead were now turned directly toward Clara, lips parted as if about to speak. The recorder in her hand continued in her own voice. "Naples isn't built on dead cities. The cities are still alive, and they're watching us." Clara didn't remember leaving the excavation site. The journey from the underground chamber to her small apartment near Piazza Bellini existed only as fragmented images, concerned faces, hushed conversations, the screech of emergency vehicles arriving as the university sealed off the area. Morning light filtered through thin curtains, casting her Spartan room in a clinical glow. She hadn't slept. The journal, her journal, with today's date, played on endless loop in her mind. Her own voice on the recorder haunted her, words she'd never spoken, warning of cities that created themselves. Her phone buzzed. "Professor Marini. University officials arriving. Press contained for now. Meeting at San Gennaro in 1 hour." The catacombs. Of course he'd choose there, away from institutional eyes and recording devices. Naples stirred to life outside her window. Tourists, locals, lives untouched by what lay beneath them. Clara's fingers traced the small scar near her eye, identical to the one on her mosaic double. Not similar, identical. The streets felt different as she navigated toward the catacombs. Each ancient building, each worn stone step seemed to watch her pass. Naples was one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, built layer upon layer, each civilization stacked upon the bones of the last. How many cities lay forgotten beneath her feet? "You came alone. Good." Father Domenico emerged from shadow at the catacomb entrance. The elderly priest had been liaison between the church and archaeological teams for decades. His eyes, keen despite his age, studied her with new wariness. "Marini sent you. Marini is detained by university officials." The priest's words were careful, measured. "He suggested you might benefit from seeing what lies beneath San Gennaro." The catacombs were officially closed to visitors. yellow tape marking the entrance. Father Domenico unlocked the gate with practiced ease. "The church has always known Naples breathes," he said, leading her down worn limestone steps. "The ancients called it La Città che Respira, the breathing city." The temperature dropped as they descended, the familiar damp coolness of underground Naples surrounding them. Unlike the tourist routes with their carefully installed lighting, Father Domenico led her through narrow passages lit only by his flashlight. "These tunnels don't appear on official maps," he explained, voice echoing softly. "When Vesuvius buried Pompeii, it merely covered it. But Naples consumes and regenerates." They emerged into a small chamber Clara had never seen documented. Faded frescoes covered the walls, not Christian imagery, but geometric patterns similar to those in the newly discovered chamber. And between them, unmistakable modern elements, a subway train, electrical lines, a cellular tower. "These were uncovered in 1872, Father Domenico said. "The church commissioned studies, then sealed the findings." Clara stepped closer, archaeologist instincts overtaking fear. "That's impossible. The subway wasn't built until—" "Exactly," the priest nodded. "Yet here they are in pigments dated to the 17th century. Clara's fingers traced the patterns connecting ancient symbols to modern elements. The precision was unnerving, not the work of a fortune teller or prophet, but someone with photographic knowledge of the future. "There's a document from 1658, Father Domenico continued, describing a chamber that appeared beneath the cathedral, containing perfect renderings of the city as it would be centuries later. The chamber disappeared 3 days after discovery, collapsing into nothing." Clara's breath caught. "Like our chamber might do." "The church has records of 17 such appearances throughout Naples' history. Always the same pattern: discovery, documentation, disappearance." "And people in the mosaics? People like me?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Father Domenico's silence was answer enough. He finally spoke. "The old texts call them I Prescelti, the chosen ones. Those whose faces appear, they become part of the cycle." "What cycle?" Clara demanded, professional detachment crumbling. The priest reached into his pocket, removing a small worn notebook. "This was found in 1943, during bombing raids that exposed another chamber. It disappeared too, but this remained." He handed her the notebook. The handwriting inside matched the journal from the chamber, matched her own hand. The final entry read, "The city shows what will be, to prevent what must not." "I don't understand," Clara whispered. "Neither do we," Father Domenico admitted. "But whatever connection exists between you and what lies beneath Naples, it isn't coincidence. The city has chosen you, Dr. Venturi. The question is why." The University of Naples buzzed with controlled chaos. Security guards blocked access to the archaeology department, while administrators huddled in closed-door meetings. Clara slipped through the side entrance, Father Domenico's notebook burning in her pocket like contraband. Professor Marini waited in the small conference room, alongside 3 people Clara didn't recognize: an elderly woman with steel-rimmed glasses, a military officer in plain clothes whose posture betrayed his profession, and a young man furiously typing on a laptop. "Dr. Venturi," Marini began, his voice tight, "this is Dr. Esposito from the National Archaeological Museum, Colonel Ricci from Civil Protection, and Marco Bianchi, our new documentation specialist." The military presence confirmed what Clara already suspected. This had escalated beyond academic curiosity. "The site has been classified," Colonel Ricci stated without preamble. "Your team's findings are now under government supervision." "On what grounds?" Clara challenged, professional instinct overriding caution. "Public safety," he replied, sliding photographs across the table. "These were taken 4 hours ago. The images showed the chamber they'd discovered, but drastically changed. The mosaics had expanded, covering more walls. New figures had appeared, including several Clara recognized from the excavation team. "This is impossible," she whispered. "Mosaics don't create themselves." "That's not all," Dr. Esposito interjected, her voice carrying the weight of decades in academia. She pushed forward enlarged images of the mosaic borders. These patterns contain dates. Clara leaned forward. The geometric designs she'd initially dismissed as decorative now revealed themselves as a numerical system, one she recognized from Father Domenico's notebook. Some correspond to historical events, Dr. Esposito continued. The 1631 eruption of Vesuvius, the 1884 cholera epidemic, the bombing of 1943. Her finger moved to another section, and these appear to be future dates. Clara's throat tightened. Including today. The room fell silent. Marco stopped typing. "What happens today?" Colonel Ricci demanded. "I don't know," Clara admitted, "but there's a pattern to the dates. They're not chronological, they're arranged by type of event." She quickly sketched on a notepad, connecting dots that only she could see. The notebook had shown her the system, a mapping of catastrophes organized by magnitude and proximity. "If I'm reading this correctly, these dates form sequences of escalating disasters. And this one," she pointed to today's date, "is part of a sequence that hasn't completed. You're suggesting these mosaics predict disasters?" Marini's skepticism was palpable. "I'm suggesting they document them," Clara corrected. "The question is whether they're warnings or recordings." "That's preposterous," Colonel Ricci snapped. "Next you'll claim ancient Romans had time machines." "What I claim," Clara said, keeping her voice steady, "is that we have a phenomenon we can't explain with current archaeological understanding. The chamber is changing, the mosaics are expanding, and they contain information no one could have known when they were created." Dr. Esposito studied Clara with unnerving intensity. "There's something you haven't shared with us." Clara hesitated. Revealing Father Domenico's notebook might compromise him, yet withholding information felt equally dangerous. "There are records of similar discoveries throughout Naples' history," she finally said. "Chambers that appear, display impossible knowledge, then disappear." "Folklore," Marini dismissed. "Documented by the Church," Clara countered, "and by previous archaeological teams whose findings were suppressed." The accusation hung in the air. "What exactly are you implying, Doctor?" "Venturi." Colonel Ricci's voice had dropped dangerously low. Before she could answer, Marco's laptop chimed. "The security feed. Something's happening at the site." He turned the screen. The live feed showed the chamber in darkness, emergency lights casting long shadows. For a moment, nothing seemed amiss. Then Clara noticed movement, subtle, almost imperceptible. The mosaic figures were shifting position. "I need to go back down there," Clara stated, already standing. "Absolutely not," Colonel Ricci barred her path. "That site is quarantined until we understand what we're dealing with." "You don't understand," Clara insisted. "I'm part of this. My face is in those mosaics." The revelation silenced the room. "If what I've learned is correct, the chamber won't remain accessible for long. We need to document everything before it's gone." Dr. Esposito's eyes narrowed. "Gone where exactly?" "Back into the city," Clara answered. "Naples doesn't just build on its past, it absorbs it, and sometimes it shows us fragments of what's buried." The train to Rome clattered through the Italian countryside, but Clara barely registered the passing landscape. Her mind remained 20 meters beneath Naples, with the shifting mosaics that bore her face. Colonel Ricci had refused her re-entry to the site, placing armed guards at the excavation entrance. Her protests fell on deaf ears. The military's involvement had changed everything. She'd left Naples without telling anyone, using her old Vatican research credentials to secure urgent access to archives typically closed to outside scholars. If the Church had documented these phenomena for centuries, the answers lay in Rome, not in military quarantines. "You're being watched," Father Domenico had warned before she left. "Be careful what you find. Some knowledge isn't meant to be unearthed." The Rome terminal bustled with afternoon travelers. Clara caught a glimpse of herself in a window reflection, dark circles under her eyes, hair disheveled. She barely recognized herself. 3 days since the discovery, and already she was unraveling. The Vatican Library loomed ahead, its imposing facade a reminder of power maintained through controlled information. Clara's contact, Monsignor Rossi, met her at a side entrance, his expression grave. "Your request mentioned geological anomalies beneath Naples," he said. leading her through corridors few visitors ever saw. "I've prepared the relevant materials, but I must ask, what's your real interest?" "The truth," Clara replied, meeting his gaze directly. Rossi's laugh was humorless. A dangerous commodity in these halls, he led her to a small reading room deep within the library complex. A table held several bound volumes, their leather covers cracked with age. "These haven't been catalogued in the public system," Rossi explained. "They're from the Archivio Segreto, documents the Church prefers to contextualize before scholarly access." Clara opened the nearest volume. 17th century Italian filled the brittle pages, reports from Jesuit observers in Naples. Her archaeological training allowed her to decipher the text. "The chamber discovered beneath San Lorenzo has vanished completely, leaving no trace. The drawings we commissioned show modern conveyances and buildings wholly unknown to our time. The bishop insists these visions are divine warnings of what may come, but I remain unconvinced of their heavenly origin." Clara turned pages with growing urgency. Each documented case followed the same pattern: discovery, documentation, disappearance, sometimes within days, sometimes weeks, never longer than a month. "Has anyone established the cause?" she asked, not looking up. "The Church has theories," Rossi replied carefully, "none satisfactory from a scientific perspective." A smaller volume caught her attention, its binding different from the others. Inside, detailed sketches showed mosaics nearly identical to those beneath Naples now. The margins contained a familiar geometric pattern. "This symbol," Clara said, pointing to a recurring mark. "It appears in Father Domenico's notebook and in our chamber." Rossi leaned closer, his composure slipping. "It shouldn't be in both places." "Why not?" "Because this document is from 1658. That particular codex was supposedly destroyed in the 1943 bombings." Clara's fingers traced the symbol. "Custos temporis," she read aloud. "Guardians of time," Rossi translated unnecessarily. "Not a religious order, as many assume. The term refers to architectural anomalies, structures that appear to exist outside normal temporal progression." "Buildings that show the future," Clara murmured. "Or create it," Rossi countered. "The Church has debated for centuries whether these visions cause events or merely predict them." Clara found a document describing a chamber discovered in 1884, just before the cholera epidemic. The mosaics had depicted mass graves and quarantine hospitals, scenes that later became reality. "Did anyone try to prevent it?" she asked. "Some did," Rossi admitted. "The warnings were dismissed as superstition. When cholera struck, the chamber had already vanished." A final document made Clara's blood run cold. A letter dated 1942, describing a chamber beneath Naples showing Allied bombing runs that would occur the following year. The writer's handwriting grew increasingly frantic, matching the journal from the current chamber, matching her own hand. "The cycle repeats," she whispered. "What cycle?" Rossi asked sharply. Before she could answer, a security guard appeared at the door. "Monsignor, you're needed urgently." Rossi excused himself. The moment he left, Clara photographed key pages with her phone, knowing she might not get another chance. As she worked, a loose paper slipped from one volume, a sketch of a face. Her face. The sketch was dated 1943. Heavy footsteps approached. Clara quickly replaced the volumes, tucking the sketch into her pocket. When Rossi returned, his expression had hardened. "I've been instructed to end your research session," he stated formally. "Your credentials have been questioned." "By whom?" Clara challenged. "I'm not at liberty to say, but I suggest you return to Naples immediately. Some histories are better left buried, Doctor." As she left the Vatican grounds, Clara noticed a man in a dark coat watching her from across the street. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. She quickened her pace toward the train station, the sketch burning in her pocket like an accusation. The truth was worse than she'd imagined. She wasn't just witnessing the phenomenon. She was part of its pattern, stretching back centuries. Naples greeted Clara with a sky heavy with ash. Vesuvius loomed in the distance, perpetually threatening yet dormant. The city had always existed in this state of suspended catastrophe, built on volcanic soil that could reclaim it at any moment. Clara stepped off the train to find Marco waiting, his usual energy subdued. "The military's gone," he said without preamble. Professor Marini convinced them to return control to the university. "How?" Clara demanded, knowing the military rarely relinquished authority so easily. Marco looked away. "There was an incident last night. The chamber changed." The drive to the excavation site was tense with unspoken questions. Naples passed by in a blur of ancient buildings and modern chaos. Each layer of the city holding secrets Clara now understood were more literal than metaphorical. The excavation site bustled with activity. Workers in university jumpsuits moved equipment with practiced efficiency, but Clara noticed their strained expressions, the way some refused to approach the entrance to the underground chamber. Professor Marini intercepted her before she could descend. "We need to talk first," he insisted, steering her toward the makeshift office at the edge of the site. Inside, maps and photographs covered every surface. "The chamber expanded overnight," he explained, pointing to a site diagram. "We discovered 3 new corridors, all connected to the main room. They weren't there 2 days ago." "That's architecturally impossible," Clara stated, though she no longer believed in impossibilities. "So is this." Marini handed her a photograph. New mosaics appeared in the east corridor. The image showed an aerial view of Piazza del Plebiscito, Naples' main square, rendered with photographic precision. But instead of its usual open space, the mosaic depicted chaos. Crowds fleeing, smoke rising from the center. A timestamp in the corner showed a date 1 month in the future. "There's more," Marco added, sliding forward additional photographs. The mosaics are spreading throughout the newly formed corridors. Each depicts a different location in Naples. Each shows the same event from different angles. Clara studied the images, her archaeological training battling with mounting dread. The craftsmanship was flawless, each tiny tile placed with precision impossible for ancient techniques, yet the dating confirmed these weren't modern creations. "Has anyone tried carbon dating the new sections?" she asked. Marini's expression darkened. "That's where things get complicated. The new corridors show the same age signature as the original chamber, approximately 400 years old. But the material composition changes slightly each time we test it, as if it's still forming," Clara finished. "2 workers refused to re-enter after yesterday," Marco added quietly. "They claimed the walls moved when they weren't looking." Clara needed to see for herself. Despite Marini's protests, she took a flashlight and descended the reinforced staircase into the excavation. The familiar weight of earth pressed around her, but something felt different. A subtle vibration in the stone walls, like the slow pulse of a massive organism. The main chamber appeared unchanged at first glance. The same mosaics, the same impossible depictions of modern life. But the walls had shifted, creating archways where solid stone had been before. New corridors stretched into darkness, their floors gleaming with freshly revealed mosaics. Clara followed the eastern passage, her flashlight illuminating sections of the Piazza del Plebiscito disaster scene. The detail was unnervingly precise. Facial expressions of terror, modern clothing, even a dropped smartphone with a cracked screen. This wasn't prophecy. It was documentation of an event that hadn't yet occurred. At the corridor's end, a final mosaic stopped her cold. It showed her not as an observer but as a participant in the plaza scene. In the mosaic, Clara stood at the disaster's epicenter, clutching papers that looked like the Vatican documents she'd photographed. A noise behind her made her turn. Marco stood in the archway, his expression unreadable. "They sent me to bring you back up," he said. "Marini's worried about structural integrity." "The corridors are expanding in real time," Clara replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The city isn't just showing us its past, it's creating pathways to specific locations, specific moments." "You sound like you believe it." "I've seen the church records, Marco. This has happened before. Chambers appearing, showing disasters, then disappearing after the events occur. It's a pattern, a cycle." Marco stepped closer, studying the mosaic of Clara in the plaza. "And your role in this cycle?" She touched the small scar by her eye, identical to the one on her mosaic counterpart. "I think I'm meant to witness whatever happens next. Maybe try to prevent it." "Or cause it," Marco suggested, his tone neutral, but his implication clear. The subtle vibration in the walls intensified. Dust sifted down from the ceiling as a low groan of shifting stone echoed through the corridor. "We need to leave," Marco urged. "Now." As they hurried back through the main chamber, Clara noticed something she'd missed before. The original mosaic, the one showing her face, had changed. The expression was no longer neutral but determined. And in the background, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was the outline of Vesuvius with a plume of smoke rising from its peak. The university's emergency meeting dissolved into chaos. Half the archaeological team demanded immediate publication of their findings. The other half insisted on further research before alerting the scientific community. Clara sat silent, watching academic ambition overshadow the gravity of what lay beneath Naples. "We could rewrite history," insisted Dr. Esposito, her earlier skepticism transformed into zealous excitement. The implications for predictive archaeology alone would secure funding for decades. "What we need is caution," Professor Marini countered. "We don't understand the mechanism behind these anomalies." "Anomalies?" Clara finally spoke, her voice cutting through the argument. "Is that what we're calling it now? The chamber is growing. The mosaics are changing. And they're showing an event that hasn't happened yet." Uncomfortable silence filled the room. Naples rumbled in the distance, a minor tremor, common enough to be ignored by locals. "The Geological Survey recorded 3 minor seismic events near Vesuvius this morning," Marco reported, checking his phone. "Nothing concerning, but more frequent than usual." Clara studied her colleagues' faces. The excitement in their eyes wasn't scientific curiosity, but opportunity, publications, grants, fame. None seemed to grasp what the Vatican archives had made clear. These chambers preceded disasters, always. As the meeting adjourned, Clara noticed Marini slip a folder to a man she didn't recognize, a transaction performed with practiced discretion. She followed at a distance, tracking them to a secluded corridor in the geology building. "Buyers are willing to pay triple for exclusive access," the stranger was saying, his American accent conspicuous among the Italian voices. "The market for archaeological anomalies is—" "It's not for sale," Clara interrupted, stepping from the shadows. "This isn't some curiosity for private collectors, Marini. People could die." The professor flinched, guilt flashing across his features before hardening into defiance. "You don't understand the pressures. The university is cutting funding. My department is selling evidence that could prevent a disaster," Clara finished. "I've seen the Vatican records. These chambers appear before catastrophes, not after. Whatever's happening in Piazza del Plebiscito next month, we might be able to stop it." The American sized her up with cold calculation. "Dr. Venturi, I presume. Your reputation precedes you." He extended a business card. "My clients are merely interested in documentation, not interference." Clara ignored the card. "Who exactly are your clients?" "Private collectors, museums, individuals with the means to appreciate historical significance." "You mean people willing to profit from disasters rather than prevent them?" Marini's expression darkened. "That's unfair, Clara. We don't know these mosaics predict anything. They could be elaborate hoaxes or manufactured by whoever discovers them." The accusation hung between them. Clara felt blood drain from her face. "You think I created them? That I somehow fabricated a chamber that carbon dates to the 17th century?" "Someone did," Marini said quietly. "Perhaps not you personally, but—" He stopped, reconsidering his words. "There are documents, Clara. Images of your face in archaeological finds dating back decades, always preceding unexplained phenomena." The revelation hit like physical force. "What documents?" "Records from the 1943 excavation. You're in them, identical to the mosaic, identical to you now. The military didn't leave because I convinced them. They left because they've been monitoring you all along." The tunnel seemed to constrict around her. The American backed away, sensing a situation beyond his commercial interests. "How long have you known?" Clara demanded. "Since they found your face in the archives after the chamber appeared. That's why they brought you onto the project, not for your expertise, but because you're somehow connected to these events." Another tremor shook the building, stronger this time. Dust filtered down from ceiling tiles. "It's starting," Clara whispered. "What is?" Marini asked, fear finally breaking through his academic detachment. Before she could answer, the emergency lighting flashed on. An alarm blared through the building, not the fire alarm, but the evacuation signal used for structural damage. "The chamber," Clara said, already running toward the excavation site. "It's collapsing." She sprinted through panicked students evacuating in the opposite direction. At the site, workers scrambled from the entrance as another tremor hit. The reinforced supports groaned under pressure not from above, but from within, as if the earth itself were shifting. Clara pushed past security barriers, ignoring Marini's shouts behind her. She had to see for herself. The main chamber had transformed completely. The original mosaics remained, but the walls now curved organically, reshaping themselves around new corridors that stretched in all directions. At the center, where her image had been, a new mosaic dominated, a perfect replica of Piazza del Plebiscito, with one addition. Beneath the plaza, a network of chambers identical to the one she stood in, expanding toward the surface. The realization struck with terrible clarity. The city wasn't just showing disasters, it was reshaping itself toward them, creating pathways that would eventually emerge at the locations depicted in the mosaics. "It's not predicting," she whispered to the empty chamber. "It's preparing." Naples awoke to emergency sirens. Streets near the university had been cordoned off, police barricades redirecting morning traffic. Local news reported seismic anomalies and possible structural concerns beneath the archaeological district. No mention of expanding chambers or prophetic mosaics. Clara pushed through crowds of onlookers, her university ID barely convincing the officers to let her through. The excavation site had transformed overnight into a military operation, uniformed personnel replacing academic researchers, specialized equipment monitoring the unstable ground. Colonel Ricci stood at the perimeter, his earlier skepticism replaced by grim focus. "Dr. Venturi," he acknowledged, "I wondered when you'd appear." "You need to evacuate Piazza del Plebiscito," Clara stated without preamble. "Whatever's happening underground is connected to that location. Based on mosaic prophecies." His tone remained professional but doubtful. "We're monitoring all major public spaces as a precaution, but there's no scientific basis for targeted evacuation." "There's no scientific basis for anything that's happened this week," Clara countered. "The chamber has grown beyond all possibility. The mosaics are still changing, and the tremors are getting stronger." As if to punctuate her point, the ground shuddered. Nearby equipment registered the vibration, technicians calling out readings. "That's the 7th today," Ricci admitted, "but the geological survey confirms they're localized, not volcanic or tectonic." "Then what are they?" Ricci hesitated, military discipline battling with the unprecedented situation. "The chamber appears to be expanding horizontally. Our ground-penetrating radar shows tunnels forming in real time, extending toward the city center." "Toward Piazza del Plebiscito," Clara pressed. "Among other locations," he conceded. "We've detected similar formations beneath the National Archaeological Museum and San Carlo Theater." Clara's mind raced. The mosaics had shown multiple sites, all historic landmarks, all places where Naples' past and present collided most visibly. "I need to see the latest scans," she insisted. Ricci led her to a monitoring station where Marco worked alongside military technicians. Digital displays showed a three-dimensional map of subterranean Naples, red lines indicating the spreading network of new tunnels. "They're following historical pathways," Clara realized, tracing the pattern. Ancient Roman roads, Greek foundations, medieval tunnels. The new formations are mapping onto existing historical infrastructure. "Like a nervous system connecting to pre-existing pathways," Marco suggested, his academic curiosity briefly overriding fear. Clara spotted Father Domenico at the edge of the site, observing silently. She approached him while Ricci was distracted. "The church has seen this before," she said quietly. "Not just the chambers appearing, but the spreading pattern beneath the city." The priest nodded, his lined face grave. "In 1631, before Vesuvius erupted. In 1884, before the cholera." in 1943, before the bombings. He paused, studying her with penetrating intensity. The city remembers its traumas, Dr. Venturi. And sometimes it tries to warn us. But why me? Why is my face in these mosaics? Perhaps because you're meant to understand, to interpret. His gaze drifted to the excavation entrance, or perhaps because you're part of what's coming. Before she could question him further, a massive tremor shook the ground. Equipment toppled as fissures spiderwebbed across the pavement. Personnel scrambled for stable ground, calling for evacuation. "Everyone out," Ricci ordered. "All non-essential personnel clear the area." The shaking intensified. A support beam at the excavation entrance snapped with a sound like gunfire. Clara watched in horrified fascination as the opening collapsed inward, not as if crushed from above, but as if pulled from within, the earth reclaiming what had been exposed. "The chamber," she whispered, realization dawning. "It's closing itself." The tremors subsided, leaving an eerie stillness. Where the excavation entrance had been now lay only rubble and twisted metal. The chamber had sealed itself, its secrets once again buried beneath Naples. But Clara knew better. It hadn't disappeared. It had simply moved, traveling through the city's underground network toward its intended destinations. Her phone vibrated with an emergency alert. Minor explosion reported at Piazza del Plebiscito. Gas leak suspected. First responders on scene. "It's starting," she told Father Domenico, showing him the alert. "Then we must hurry," he replied, gesturing toward his car. "The cycle won't wait for disbelief." Clara glanced back at Ricci and his team, still focused on the collapsed excavation. They were looking backward, studying what had vanished. She needed to look forward, to where the chamber would emerge next. As they drove toward the city center, Naples transformed around them. Streets crowded with people responding to emergency alerts, some fleeing, others drawn by morbid curiosity. Church bells rang in unsynchronized alarm, adding to the cacophony of sirens and shouting. The sky above Vesuvius darkened, not with volcanic activity, but with gathering storm clouds that seemed to concentrate directly above the mountain, weather as dramatic backdrop to human chaos. They'll never evacuate in time, Clara realized, watching the growing crowds. No one will believe what's coming until it's already here. 1 month later, Clara sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by case files that no longer officially existed. The chamber beneath the university had disappeared completely, leaving no evidence it had ever been there. Ground-penetrating radar showed only solid earth where tunnels had once spread like veins through Naples' underground. The military had withdrawn, scientists had moved on to more explicable phenomena, and Clara had been quietly removed from the university's archaeology department. Stress-induced perception anomalies, the official explanation read. Her colleagues distanced themselves, careers preserved through collective silence. Only Marco occasionally called, his voice carrying the strain of someone caught between loyalty and self-preservation. The gas explosion at Piazza del Plebiscito had been minor, a ruptured line that caused more smoke than fire. Nothing like the catastrophe depicted in the mosaics, nothing worth remembering. Clara opened her notebook, comparing her handwriting to the photographs she'd taken in the Vatican archives. The similarity was undeniable, not just stylistic resemblance, but precise matching of pressure points and letter formation. She had somehow written documents centuries before her birth. Her phone buzzed with a message from Father Domenico. "Found something. Come quickly." The church of San Lorenzo Maggiore stood empty when Clara arrived. Father Domenico waited in the small archaeological museum beneath the church, among remnants of the Greek and Roman city that preceded modern Naples. "The archivists in Rome sent this," he said without greeting, handing her a worn leather folio. It was misfiled for decades. Inside lay a report dated 1631, describing a chamber discovered before Vesuvius eruption. The document contained sketches of mosaics showing volcanic destruction and faces of people who would witness it. "The last page," Father Domenico urged. Clara turned to it, her breath catching. A perfect rendering of her face stared back, alongside a notation. "The observer returns through cycles, neither cause nor prevention, but witness." "I don't understand," she whispered. Some people appear repeatedly throughout history at moments of transformation, Father Domenico explained. Not physically, but their essence, captured in art, in writing, in memory. The Church has documented such recurrences for centuries. You're suggesting reincarnation? I'm suggesting patterns beyond our comprehension. The city remembers, Dr. Venturi, and sometimes it chooses specific individuals to remember with it. A tremor shook the building, subtle but distinct. Father Domenico's expression tightened. It's starting again, he said. Come. They descended deeper beneath the church, through medieval foundations into older Roman structures. The air grew cooler, the walls more ancient with each level they passed. The city breathes in cycles, Father Domenico explained as they walked, inhaling history, exhaling warnings. The chambers appear when pressure builds, when trauma approaches. They reached a small door Clara had never noticed during previous archaeological visits. The priest unlocked it with a key that looked as ancient as the stones surrounding them. This section isn't on any public tour, he said, for good reason. Beyond lay a small chamber with a single mosaic on the floor, identical in style to those in the vanished chamber. But this one showed something new. Clara standing in a ruined version of the university excavation site, surrounded by fragments of the future. It's been here since 1631, Father Domenico said quietly, waiting for you. Clara knelt beside the mosaic, recognizing her own face with terrible clarity. She touched the small scar by her eye, the one that connected her to every image throughout centuries. Am I causing these events? She asked, voice barely audible. Or meant to prevent them? Neither, Father Domenico replied. You're a connector, a consciousness that bridges moments when Naples remembers its own future. Clara opened her notebook again, studying the symbols she'd been unconsciously drawing since the chamber appeared. They matched the border patterns of the mosaic perfectly. I've been part of this all along, she realized, writing warnings to myself across centuries. She turned to the final blank page in her notebook and began to write, her hand moving with certainty that wasn't entirely her own. The words formed in perfect match to the ancient documents she'd seen in Rome. Non finis, sed iterum. Not the end, but again. As she wrote, the ground trembled once more. Father Domenico stepped back as cracks appeared in the floor around the mosaic. It's reclaiming itself, he said, as it always does. The mosaic began to sink, stones separating as the earth shifted beneath. Clara watched her own image disappear piece by piece into darkness, not destroyed, but returning to the city's depths until needed again. When the last piece vanished, only smooth stone floor remained. No evidence of what had been there moments before, no proof of centuries of warnings and witnesses. It will return, Father Domenico said, when Naples needs to remember again. Clara closed her notebook, understanding finally settling into her bones. She wasn't meant to prevent disasters or explain mysteries. She was memory incarnate, a living record connecting past and future through conscious recognition. Naples would forget the chambers, the mosaics, the warnings. History would smooth over anomalies, explanations would replace wonder, and life would continue in comfortable ignorance. But she would remember. And when the city breathed again, revealing its hidden patterns to future generations, her consciousness would be there, perhaps in another form, another time, but recognizable in the eternal cycle of remembering and forgetting that defined Naples' relationship with its own impossible history. As the final chapter of The Lost City That Appeared and Disappeared out of nowhere draws to a close, we're left with the haunting realization that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but experienced. Clara Venturi didn't find answers beneath Naples. She found her place in an eternal pattern, a witness chosen by time itself. What would you do if you discovered your face in centuries-old art? Would you run from the responsibility, or embrace your role as history's conscious memory? Perhaps the true mystery isn't in the shifting chambers or prophetic mosaics, but in how we respond when confronted with forces beyond our understanding. Naples reminds us that cities aren't merely collections of buildings and streets. They're living records of human experience, breathing with the accumulated weight of all who've walked their paths. Some patterns repeat, not because they're inevitable, but because we've forgotten how to recognize them. If this story resonated with you, consider what warnings from the past you might be overlooking in your own life. What cycles are you part of without realizing? Share this exploration of archaeological horror with others who appreciate the delicate balance between history and mystery. Subscribe for more journeys into the places where science trembles at the edge of the inexplicable. And remember, sometimes the most profound discoveries aren't found in what we unearth, but in what we finally allow ourselves to see.